Hello everyone, I'm back and talking to you more about the Nicomachean Ethics. Now we're looking at Book 4. Book 3, if you recall, ended with a couple of discussions, courage and temperance. So the laundry list of virtues was begun. And this one I call the laundry list of virtues because the whole book really is just a discussion of various virtues. Why these? Why not others? That question has been asked many times. Immanuel Kant, the great Prussian thinker, was very puzzled by this and thought that this was a flaw, that Aristotle's work didn't really tell us why you had these particular virtues and not others. I think it's largely connected, though, with Aristotle's culture, and in a previous video I talked a little bit about how Aristotle wants to do a moral psychology. So what's realistic, and what's realistic is ultimately going to turn on what people actually do, and what people actually do is really nothing other than a culture. But anyways, we'll look more at Aristotle's connections to Greek culture in another video. For this video, I just want to go through roughly and make a couple of comments on this so-called laundry list. Well, there's about 9 chapters in this book, and chapters 1 and 2 really are about dealing with money. So it's interesting that Aristotle thought that was important. But of course, as we've seen, Aristotle does regard to some external things as important for the establishment of virtue. And ultimately, remember what we're after, eudaimonia. So part of what goes into eudaimonia, but it shouldn't be identified with eudaimonia, is money, is wealth, is comfort of living, a certain standard of living. Aristotle thinks that that is important. That's going to play a role in having a happy life, because that's ultimately what eudaimonia roughly is about, having a good, moral, and happy life. So his first two deal with money. Chapter 1 deals with open-handedness, sometimes called generosity or liberality. How to be good with your money in terms of being not too stingy with it, but not too spendthrift, or not too liberal with it, but hitting the mean, that is spending your money appropriately. A larger scale is money with respect to munificence. So if you're more dealing with larger scale projects, how to properly handle money on a larger scale. So again, we have seen many times that the notion of ethics just slides right into politics. Well, being good with money is important not only for us as individual private citizens, but being good with money is also important for people that are, shall we say, keepers of the public purse. So the same rough set of skills is going to go into both. Both are virtues. The proper handling of money, again, in the proper context. Chapter 3 is a bit of a shift, goes into what is known as greatness of soul. Now, greatness of soul is, shall we say, it's kind of two basic properties. Basically, if you have greatness of soul, you're kind of a great person and you know it. It's not a sense of really being egotistical. It's you're being really skillful. It's like if you met Einstein and he said, "I'm not bad at physics. I'm actually pretty good at it." You wouldn't regard that as boasting. I don't think so. I think that'd be very odd to say, "Oh, wow, what an ego." You'd say, "No, he's right. He's pretty good at that." Or if Einstein were to say to you, "Oh, well, I'm not that good at physics," you'd probably think, "Is this false modesty or this is weird?" So in the notion of greatness of soul is basically, if you've got it, if you really have it in the true sense, and you're not just an egotistical person, you're great at something and you know it, and you're not bragging about it. It's more or less a statement of fact. There's a fit, shall we say, between the worth, the great ability to do physics, and the knowledge. Yes, I know I'm good at that. So it is something that's not just a subjective whim or whatever. You don't have greatness of soul if you just assert you're great. And it would be, if someone is constantly telling you they're great or whatever, without ever demonstrating it, that's not greatness of soul either. and also someone who is great at something but then doesn't really realize it. They're lacking something. They're lacking some knowledge about what they can do. So there is a fit between worth and knowledge. So a soul that lacks either of these is going to fall into a different kind of category. Now, Aristotle thinks that the great-souled person is, some kind of more worthy type person. So worthy of the best, so he is the best person and would also be a good person. So now there's all kinds of questionable aspects about this, and again, when I look more into Aristotle's connection to his culture, we'll find that this is sort of the upright Athenian man of the time that really Aristotle seems to be using as his model, and so there is a link to the culture, no question, and I'll talk about that in another video. But for now, Aristotle gives the notion of the great soul as a kind of, shall we say, an adornment of the excellences. It augments them. It doesn't occur without them. So it's going to be the excellence by the virtues. Like, it would be very difficult to be a great-souled person because you would be possessed of so many. You would need to possess so many virtues to do it. So it's not something that the average person is just going to easily attain. This is quite a special kind of individual, and it's going to be largely determined by the context of the society. And in Aristotle's case, it is pretty well a sort of the upstanding Greek citizen of his time. Now, Aristotle gives us and not surprisingly, he gives us a few behaviors. So the great-souled person would accept honor, would be comfortable with accepting honor from honorable people, not from dishonorable people. So you're known by the company you keep, so you're not going to accept honor from disreputable folks, only honor from the honorable. Moderately disposed, this is kind of a Platonic notion, moderately disposed to wealth and power, not obsessive over it, certainly not, visibly constantly striving over it, because that would be an excess, and that's not exactly a virtue. But wouldn't be adverse to it either. The great-souled person has, in Aristotle's view, a sense of, is justified in looking down on others, right? So this is going to deviate from certain notions of that we may today have of justice and fairness. This great-souled person is somebody that is going to pass judgment on others. That's part of being a great soul. And passing judgment on himself, and is just correct, that is worthy and knowledgeable, but would clearly pass judgment on others that are deemed not worthy and knowledgeable. The great-souled person is going to be very honest about hopes, even about fears, because hopes and being honest about hopes and loves and even fears, to not conceal them implies a kind of courage, or to try and conceal is a kind of duplicity. And of course, being duplicitous is, in Aristotle's words, kind of being fearful, not the mark of a great-souled person. The great-souled person is not tending to be overly impressed with others, right? And not tending to express great admiration. So in that sense, if you've probably picked up on this, the great-souled person is someone who does not want to become subordinated in any way to anyone else. So we might say, has a bit of a problem with authority. Aristotle also talks about paying back, right? The great-souled person always pays someone back immediately, is never in anyone's debt. As a matter of fact, pays back a little bit more to, instead of being in someone's debt, you pay back a little bit more, you put someone in your debt. So we now might say the great-souled person in Aristotle's view plays a little bit of sort of the one-upmanship game. So anyways, this is a contrast to what Aristotle will call meanness of soul, or the little-souled person who is deficient in a variety of ways. So it's not quite the great-souled isn't really a virtue, it's a kind of an adornment, or someone who's captured a number of the virtues and embodies them. So that takes us to now chapter 4, where Aristotle discusses the idea of honor. He is a sort of a nameless virtue in there that he talks about, but it centers on the notion of honor. Chapter 5, Aristotle deals with the appropriateness of anger, getting your anger under control, not eliminating it, but knowing how, when, where, what is the mean in a specific circumstance of when you should get angry. So again, that's a good one to clearly drive home that this is not a doctrine of moderation. So the true Aristotelian person, even to go back to the one with the greatness of soul, the greatness of soul would, or the person who has it, would clearly in some circumstances get angry. But it's how you handle. So this is Aristotle's maybe take on anger management, right? Getting it under control and exercising it properly. Now, a lot of these are social aspects, and we dive right into the social virtues with chapters 6 to 8, or as I say, it's tea time with Aristotle, and you have the 3 social excellences, or the 3 social virtues. Right? And a lot of them are dealing with the notion of conversation. Well, dealing with the notion of conversation, you are dealing in the context of polite society. And what is polite society? Well, that's going to depend on a number of factors in the culture, and which ones are regarded and applauded. Again, that's going to depend on the culture. So here we see a clear connection of Aristotle's moral and cultural psychology coming out, because we're now talking about how to behave in polite company, more or less. So this tells us not necessarily from a historical point exactly what might have been accepted, but certainly what Aristotle thought more or less was properly accepted. So chapter 6, when you're talking about pleasing, being good at getting along with others, not pleasing, how to go about and do that, how to hit the mean, not to be too accommodating and not to be someone who's not accommodating enough. So again, dealing with others and pleasing them. So how you can relate to others. How you present yourself is the topic of chapter 7. Proper ways in order to present yourself, in order to have a good opinion of yourself, and to create a better milieu in which people talk. Also, in chapter 8, Aristotle doesn't use this expression, but kicking back and being funny. It's not all seriousness. Aristotle talks about humor as being an important part of social life, being funny, being able to be witty and amusing and talk to people in this sense. So life does involve relaxation, kicking back, enjoying yourself. As I mentioned earlier, Aristotle is not some ascetic. He doesn't say, life is just to be miserable. Life has its miseries, but that's not its primary focus. Life involves pleasures. Get them under control. Remember, from the cradle, pleasures distract us and can lead us astray, but that doesn't mean you never indulge and enjoy yourself. So in this one, Aristotle says, when you're relaxing and having fun and goofing off, there is a way, I know it sounds a little odd, but there's a way to be virtuous as you goof off. Kind of like a harmless bit of fun, as someone might say. It could be in the sense of, if you are trying to be amusing, which is fine, but don't do it in the sense where you come across, as Aristotle and some of the translations make him say, that you come across as a buffoon. Right? You don't want to come across as someone who can't understand jokes or anything like that, and you don't want to come across as being obsessed with going for the laugh, as a comedian might say. So in that sense, you don't want to be boorish and stiff, nor ridiculous and being a buffoon. You want to hit the middle, and to hit the middle in this, kicking back and being funny, is to aim at wit, right? Being a good conversationalist, someone who is funny and charming, and somebody who is also good at kicking back and being funny and pleasing and knows all these things, is someone who is going to be a good conversationalist, pleasant company, can be funny, but also what's very important is knowing when to be serious, when not to take something as a joke. Because again, not everything's a joke. So this idea of knowing when things are not a joke as being a kind of a mean, right? Because remember, it's adjusting yourself in the circumstances, leads fairly nicely to the last part of this book, the section chapter 9, which is a remark on shame. Now, Aristotle, he thinks shame is a good thing. Right? Now, there's been a lot of studies on Greek society, and again, when I do a little bit more on that, and shame was a big part of Greek society. There have been a number of books published where they talk about ethics in the early Greek context, maybe a little earlier than Aristotle, like in the Homeric context, which, as you read the Nicomachean Ethics, you see Aristotle quotes Homer a lot, sort of like the way people will sometimes quote the Bible or their whatever sacred scripture they like. It tells you that the work of Homer was regarded by Aristotle as either something you follow or something you might reject or whatever. But it's important stuff. Now, in Homeric, in the Homeric works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, shame does play a big role. And that's part of the ancient military type of ethics, which is an interesting topic, but that'll be for another time. But Aristotle wants to point out that shame is important. And shame is important because it does shape us. Now, shame is not an excellence or an arete. It's more of an emotion, a feeling of, or a fear of disrepute. It makes people react. Aristotle was where you have a bodily reaction, the visceral reaction, you blush and you just kind of scrunch up and you want to hide, etc., etc. Makes you sometimes, blush and then turn pale, and it changes your appearance. So it's an affectation or rather than a disposition. But he thinks it's a good thing, not to be exploited to a great degree, but shame is good for building character, Aristotle says. But it's for the young. Why? Because the young, and we've seen Aristotle thinks that like children can't have eudaimonia. He thinks that, remember in earlier videos, that children, yes, they have voluntary actions, but they don't really have choice because they don't govern their actions by reason. They govern their actions, their actions are impulsive. Well, when you're dealing with organisms that are impulsive, but organisms that are on their way to developing virtues and on their way to using reason, etc., and all that, then sometimes shame is a pretty good thing. Why? Well, he says we praise. Now, here he's talking about his society. You can think about, today our views on this are quite different. So this is a good illustration of how different Aristotle does think than a lot of people do today. So Aristotle says, we praise people. We think it's a good thing when people have a sense of shame. And sometimes you hear people saying, that's shameless. And that's not a compliment when people say that other people have no sense of shame. So what would be the argument, the logic of it? Well, it goes something like this. Why do we praise the youth, Aristotle says, who have a sense of shame? Well, their sense of shame will block them. When reason won't work with the youth, according to Aristotle, shame will play a role. When you tell people that that's a shameful act, don't bring shame on your community or your family or your parents or whatever, Aristotle says that can be a good check on the spiritedness of youth. So in that sense, we will praise the young people who have a sense of shame for that. We go, good, because you have a check on your emotions. Later on, though, it shouldn't be shame that's doing the check. So Aristotle said we praise the youth for having the shame as a check on their behaviors and emotions and things like that. But we shouldn't praise older people for it. Why? Well, because after a while, it's your reason that should be providing the check. You should outgrow the need for shame as a check on your behavior. You should be moving into the territory where you're making choices and deliberating on things. You're moving out of you're still in the voluntary, but you're moving away from the voluntary in terms of impulse that has to be corrected by shame to the voluntary where you can still have impulses or whatever, but it's all being governed and run through reason, and eventually those impulses are being shall we say, moderated and pushed to the side in favor of dispositional behavior, virtue. So in that sense, an older person should have self-control. That's really what virtues ultimately are about. And but again, self-control isn't exactly a complete virtue either. It's a little more complex than that. But Aristotle says that I'm going to get back into self-control a little bit later. But he remarks that shame is part of, for him, shame is part of of a proper upbringing. And when you get rid of that, not for adults, I mean, because adults, again, don't need it. They shouldn't need it. But with children, that's going to be a big problem. So you can think about it, whether or not how we view, or at least how many people view shame today. It's arguably quite different than what Aristotle would have thought. So with his remark on shame, he ends this book, and he says the next big virtue that I want to turn to, and it's going to occupy Aristotle for a lot of territory in the Nicomachean Ethics, and we'll look at it in the next video, and that is the notion and the virtue of justice. And justice is huge in Greek thought. As a matter of fact, Plato's Republic, the central question is, what is justice? So we can think of Aristotle responding to Plato as he did earlier on when he had all those criticisms of the Platonists. Now he's going to turn his attention to a key virtue, which is for the individual and the city, and that's the notion of justice. And I'll see you for that in the next video.